We have a gunshot wound to the head. So imagine you're a neurosurgeon on call. It's 2 a.m., and that's the emergency room doctor on the line. That is a very lonely call. Many conditions in neurosurgery these days can be managed by competing specialists with the right fellowship training. Neurologists and interventional radiologists can treat cerebral aneurysms. Orthopedists can perform spinal surgery. But when it comes to a gunshot wound to the head, there is no one clamoring for that case. No one at your back. And as a neurosurgeon, you will always be called. Our neurosurgeon in Washington, D.C., Dr. Bob Keating, will now tell us about one such case. And like many of these stories, even those where the outcome seems preordained, there's a twist.
He was still pouring blood out of his head into the surrounding bandages and bed sheets. There was an immediate need to get things moving if we had any chance of saving this patient. So I told my resident, if he's alive and he's moving everything, we need to try to do something to maintain his life. I told my resident, I'll meet you in the OR, get him downstairs, make sure there's lots of blood prepared, and we'll do the best that we can. Well, the prognosis didn't sound good. He had received at that point up to 10 units of blood, and by report was hemorrhaging extensively despite pressure and packaging placed around his exit site on the head. But nevertheless, his pupils are still working, and surprisingly, he was still moving everything. So as I drove into the hospital quickly, fortunately only a 12-minute drive away, I was now wondering, what do we do about the bleeding? This is involving one of the sinuses, which received 20% of the patient's blood at any point in time, and that can be very challenging to deal with. It's hard now trying to stop uncontrolled bleeding in a gunshot wound. And then I get to the operating room, and as usual, the dedicated and professional teams were in the process of getting him ready. They were putting in tubes and lines, trying to just keep up with his massive blood loss. And as we brought him in, I looked at my resident and I said, this guy's not 14. He looks closer to 25. And the resident said, yeah, we all thought the same, but somebody at the scene said he was 14. And that's why they brought him here rather than to the city hospital next door. I went out to talk to the family. At this point, the anesthesiologists were trying with tremendous effort to just get his blood pressure to a point where he would tolerate putting him to sleep and then removing or opening up the gunshot exit wound and trying to do whatever could stem the bleeding. So I had a few minutes, and I wanted to at least let the family know what was going on, and perhaps more importantly, that the prognosis was poor at best. And then when I went into just myself, there were a number of family members in the room, his mother, a number of sisters and his aunts, and obviously quite concerned and upset. And I remember the mother looking at me saying, please do what you can to save him. We were here 3 years ago when he was shot 14 times, and they did a great job here in saving him. And I looked at the mother in somewhat disbelief. I said, 14 times? She said, yes, he was involved with a gang war, and he got shot 14 times, and they were able to save him when they brought him here to Children's Hospital. And I looked at Mom, I said, is he really 14? He looks a lot older. She says, oh no, he's 20. But we thought this is the best place, and that's why we told him he was 14. Any other place, he would have died. And I understood as a parent what Mom was saying, and I couldn't blame her for that. And I said to her, I said, well, look, I said, I don't know what's going to happen. He's bleeding uncontrollably right now, and we're trying to get just enough blood into him so we can get ahead of the curve. But I said, in all honesty, I'll do everything I can, but I may not be able to save him. There appeared to be liters of blood pouring out of his head onto the floor. And it certainly looked as if blood was not congealing at all, that he was perhaps in what we call DIC, where the patients just start to bleed everywhere. But we're there, ready to go. Massive transfusion protocol was going on. And we started to try to at least get some control. And as we started to work with the incision, just to be able to see what we're dealing with, blood and brain products continued to shoot across the room, obviously under tremendous pressure. and hemorrhaging more blood than we could actually put into his into his veins. And so after a period of time, it was very clear we were not going to be able to get direct control what at that time was most likely the sinus. We did our best to pack it off and then just close the skin to at least stem the bleeding itself. And although we were eventually able to close the skin with great effort, and we didn't have copious liters of blood flowing onto the floor, it was pretty obvious that that in itself may stop his actual hemorrhaging, but unfortunately would be transmitted to the brain itself. And by the time we left the operating room shortly after this, one could appreciate that his pupils were no longer working, and nor was there anything else that was functioning as consistent with a picture of brain death. And I sat and reflected and thought, how could such a young man, potentially so full of promise, have survived the first time to come back a second time to the place where it all began? And I thought to myself, he probably never had a chance. This is his routine, and despite being fortunate beyond all belief and having won the lottery the first time after he was shot, he was unable to capitalize on that and still was hanging out with the wrong people at the wrong time. And at this point, I was unable to give him an additional lease on life. And I went out to tell Mom and his sisters and aunts that he was no longer hemorrhaging from the head, but unfortunately the pressure in the brain was increasing every minute, and it was unlikely we'd be able to save him. And I felt miserable and terrible, because despite every best intention and all the right efforts and all the right neurosurgical things that we know how to do, it was a far cry from what he really needed, and we were unable to save him. It took 48 hours before the patient finally died, but it was a long 48 hours, and there were lots of discussions on how and why and what to do and so forth. But I couldn't help but think how such a lucky kid the first time was so unlucky the second time.